You're listening to the RFP Success Show with 8-time author, speaker, and CEO of the RFP Success Company, Lisa Rehurek. Tune in each episode to learn what today's capture and RFP teams are doing to increase their win percentages by up to 20, 30, and even 50%, and meet the industry trailblazers that are getting it right. Let's get started.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the RFP Success Show podcast. I am your host, Lisa Rehurek, founder and CEO of the RFP Success Company. And I would like to introduce you to our guest for today's episode, all about psychology of consumer behavior, Sean Stewart. So Sean has a really interesting background. He's got 20 years of service marketing experience, 15 of which have been in the architecture, engineering, and construction industry. And he's worked for firms, large, small, in a variety of roles, including proposal writer, proposal manager, and marketing director. He has a master's of science degree in applied psychology from USC, where he focused on consumer psychology. And when I first met Sean, this is kind of the conversation that we had. And he shared with me how he has conducted research on how visual cues unconsciously influence service provider selection. And he focuses on how to apply principles in consumer psychology and behavioral economics to proposal development and marketing professional services. And I just thought it was super fascinating and a great topic to share with all of you. So Sean's actually currently working on establishing his own consulting practice and is a partner in a residential consulting company with his wife and family. Sean, you've got a lot going on, but welcome to the podcast.
Yeah, thanks so much for inviting me.
Yeah, it's super exciting to have you here. And again, I love this topic because it's so relevant, and I don't know that very many people really pay attention to it when it comes to proposal development. So I want to kick it off by having you tell us what got you into this world of consumer psychology.
You know, it's funny. So when I first did my undergrad degree, I thought I wanted to be a therapist. And, did the whole, internship, counseling. I liked research. So I was doing some research, thinking I wanted to be a professor and therapist, and found out that it's really hard to get a job as a professor. And therapists really don't make that much, unfortunately. And also I found I really didn't like doing therapy that much. So I went into marketing, and I used kind of what I learned in marketing. Or in psychology, in marketing, and it just kind of evolved from there. And realized, I still was interested in psychology, so I wanted to learn a little bit more. And so I went back and expanded my education and really focused in on consumer psychology and what influences purchasing decisions.
I love this so much because it's such a perfect example of how, you think that one path is what you're really passionate about, but then it's interesting how what you're passionate about can show up in so many different ways, and you were able to mirror the two of those. That's pretty cool. Let's talk about what consumer psychology even is. You touched on it just a little bit, or you hinted to it a little bit, but what is consumer psychology?
So, on a basic level, it's studying how people assess, decide, purchase, and use products and services. And so in consumer psychology, you're looking at, consumer behaviors, you're looking at their beliefs, their attitudes, even some of their background and how that influences how they interact in the marketplace and decide what they're going to buy and why they're going to buy something.
It's so interesting too, right? That advertising and marketing, especially if you look at the huge firms, right? They have a pretty good grasp on who their audience is and all of that psychology. And I'm not sure we as normal non-marketing folks out in the world even realize what goes into that. But there's so much more to just putting a headline on a magazine, right?
Oh, yeah.
There's so much behind that.
Yeah. It's a very drawn out process. I mean, when you're looking at consumer goods, we're a little bit different. Typically proposal writers, we're doing what they call account-based marketing. So unlike regular consumer goods, you have thousands, millions of potential customers, and you don't have that many opportunities to reach them. For us, it's a little bit flipped in that there's very few decision makers and consumers, but we have a lot of different opportunities to interact with them. So it is a little bit different, but when you're looking at consumer goods, one of the big thing is segmentation. It's not every customer is alike. And so, we do this even in the RFP world. Like for example, in engineering firms, we do some sort of segmentation. We say, you know what, we work with schools, or we work with this type of engineering or this type of client. And we may do things like client tiers. We said, hey, these are our best clients. This is what they're like. And it could be, hey, they're mid-size agencies that have a certain type of project. So that's usually as far as we get into it. But that's okay because that works for us. But when you look at the consumer side, you're looking at surveys, you're looking at really defining society and segmenting them and identifying which one of those groups buys your product the most and how do you reach that group knowing what they're like. And so some of it's a bit overkill for what we do, but there are some techniques and things that we can apply to that, to what we do as proposals.
Yeah, let's talk about that a little bit because, in the proposal world, you're going to have one school of thought that's like, look, they ask the questions, we respond to the questions, and life is good, right? And then also we're working on a deadline. And so, for those of us that don't have a master's degree in consumer psychology, like how can we simplify this to include it in proposals without needing that master's degree, but also within the time frame that we're working in and all of that fun stuff?
Yeah. So, the good news is you don't need a master's degree in consumer psychology to apply some of this stuff. If you ever have an interest and just do some reading, there are little techniques and tricks that you can use. One example that I always go back to, and I think this is probably one of the biggest principles that you can apply, is there's a book called The Human Brand by Malone and Fisk. And they talk about the concept of warmth and competence. So they talk about brand identity. And so warmth basically is a brand or company's positive intentions towards others, towards a consumer. Competence is that company's ability to act on those intentions. And so with marketing, depending on the type of industry, you want to make sure that you either convey warmth or competence or both. For example, for more hedonistic or entertainment type services, products, like Disney entertainment, stuff like that, warmth tends to work better. Or if you're looking for a personal appeal, or if the consumer is kind of anxious, then warmth is the way to go. However, when you're looking at like professional services, so, medical, legal, you're looking at engineering, the stakes are high. If something goes wrong, you're in trouble. For medical, it'd be life and death, So in that case, actually competence is the most important. So for marketers, what you want to do is understand how you can convey warmth and competence in your proposal. What I would strongly recommend is, yes, number one, competence is minimum, the bare minimum in professional services. You have to convey that. But if you want to stand out, you also have to convey the warmth. Like, hey, look, we're here to look after you. Those types of messages. So that's one fast way to do it. Another easy way to do it is understanding how people view things and how people remember visual stimuli. Because think about it, a proposal is basically a document. You have a lot of ways to add information. So here's a good example, and I think a lot of people will be familiar with, is you ever see the call outs? That's like the big thing now, the call outs, right?
Yep.
But you notice you open a page with a call out, what do? You immediately go to the call out. Or it's either called out like really big, or it's a different color that's totally opposite of everything else. Okay, so that is what they call a pre-attentive attribute. What that means is your brain picks up on it before you're even consciously aware of it. And so you automatically track to that spot. Understanding how to use that and when to use that. And I know I've been guilty of this. I think other people have. It's, oh, hey, I have too much text. I need to break it up. I'm going to put a call out. Yeah, don't do that. You want to make sure it's what is the most important thing or number that they need to know. That's your call out, so that's because odds are there's a good chance they're not going to read the whole page, but they'll see the call out, so little tricks like that, understanding that. And then the other thing I would say is understanding behavioral economics. And so that's kind of a separate but kind of overlapping field where basically it's, economists finally realize people don't make rational decisions in purchases. In fact, most purchasing decision is unconscious. Even if you're reading a proposal, you have your score sheet, how you interpret those scores and assign scores can be influenced. And so understanding some of the things that affect your decision when you're making a money or economic decision. So for example, there's work by Daniel Kahneman and Richard Thaler. If you ever hear the phrase or the saying, you're more motivated by a loss than a gain,
Right.
that came from their research. And the reason why is because if you feel you own something, you assign higher value to that. So knowing that, if you can make it seem like we're your consultant, it's not guaranteed to win you the job, but it kind of gives you a little bit of a nudge in the right direction. So a lot of those little techniques you can apply even without, you read a couple books or just do a quick Google search on it. You can pick up a couple things and realize, hey, I can implement this into my proposal.
Subtle little nuances, right? Because we always say to people, like, people buy with emotion. Like, I don't care how into statistics and, just hardcore people are, they're still going to buy based on emotion to some degree. And the job of the proposal writer is to build trust to get to that emotion, right? And everything that you're saying in my mind is saying, oh, this is just building more trust, and speaking to that emotional side.
Totally. And, talking about building trust, if just understanding a little bit about how we view things and the emotional impact of visual images. If you work with a graphic designer in your firm, I always say the best graphic designers are artists. They have an art degree, and then they also know InDesign or Photoshop. Because just because you know how to use a program doesn't mean you understand the reason why things look good and how it impacts. So an example is, to build trust, you're looking at warmth and competence. There are actually different cues, visual cues that influence perceptions of warmth and competence. For example, things that appear solid or rigid or darker colors, blues, those elicit perceptions of competence. Things that look like light, airy, like a lot of negative space or light colors or even more warmer colors actually do elicit perceptions of warmth in an advertisement or an image. You can even do things like having a visual cue. For example, in my master's thesis, one thing I did is I looked at the role of haptic cues.
What's the word?
Haptic.
Okay.
Yeah, haptic cue. It's something that indicates you should grab or hold something. So a handle is a haptic cue. And you can see this next time you go to the store. You go to the store, look at the milk jugs, look at the detergent. Whenever the label is facing you, the handle is always going to be on your right. Most people are right-handed. So if you're lefty, sorry, you're kind of out of luck. But
I'm a lefty.
Yeah. But what they found is that whenever they put the handle on the right side, that product sells better compared to on the left if the handle's on the left. People like to interact with things that are easy to grasp. And so that concept also carries over to images. And so I actually based my thesis off of a researcher, Maya. She did this interesting study where she kind of made like a mini IKEA catalog ad. You know how you have like the clock on the wall? Yeah. So she had a clock on the wall and had a table. And on the table, it had a coffee mug. In the middle, the right, the left. And then there's another photo that some people saw without the mug. And what she found is that whenever there was the mug on the table, people wanted to buy that product more. When it was on the right and easy to grasp, it went up even more. Now, it wasn't a huge difference. It was only like 2% or something like that. But it was significant. And if you're looking at a product, with consumer good, you have so many people that can buy it. 1 or 2% is a big impact.
Right.
Now, proposals, not necessarily, but the cool thing about that is what if you apply that early in the sales process before the RFP? You have a lot of opportunities to reach them. if you consistently use the right kind of cues, that can create a bit of an impact.
How does that show up in a visual in a document? For example, like how do you take like the milk carton analogy and transfer
Yeah.
that to a visual in a document?
A good way to do it is, let's say you're doing a water project, it's an RFP for like a water system or something like that. You have your cover and there's an image somewhere of someone handing you a glass of water on the right side of their visual field. And the great thing about it, you have your team, a picture of your team, whatever. But what if you put it in front of a desk and there's a mug or a pen or something that you normally grasp on the right side of the image? It doesn't have to deal. The great thing about this and what my found was that it doesn't have to have anything at all to do with the service you're advertising, just that it's there. Now, there's one caveat, and this is what I learned the hard way, because I applied this to professional services, so medical and legal. If the image or the cue has a negative connotation, it actually does the opposite. So be very careful. So my mistake was my visual cue was a doctor handing you a prescription in the middle of the COVID pandemic. So guess what happened? It actually decreased. So it's kind of funny how that works. But even the language choice you use, for example, sensory language, you can write things that like convey weight, like Chevy, like a rock. What does that mean? It's dependable, something like that, like rock solid advice or something like that along those lines of sensory language or phrase that conveys weight or rigidness or something solid can help convey perceptions of competence.
Oh, that's fascinating. I love that. Yeah, sorry, my mind is spinning around that whole, because I was just about to ask you if we look at like non-visual, now we're looking at the content itself, and people are forming the visual in their head.
Yes.
How do we frame the verbiage so that they're forming the right image in their head? And this starts to get a little complex, right? But how can we, right? But how can we simplify that? And it sounds like what you just said, which was like using some of those anchor words. Yeah. Any other ideas on some words? So we talked about kind of like something that conveys strength. What other kind of words would we maybe use to convey other types of feelings? Competence, trust, any of that? Anything else come to your mind?
Yeah. So, I'm thinking back on my on the research I did. So on some of the attorney ads, I put, rock solid legal advice. Among the people that were actually actively or recently hired an attorney or were looking to hire an attorney, having the sensory language actually increased, hey, I want to hire that one based on this ad. On the medical, I put something like tastes better than an apple a day, but works better, or doesn't taste as good as an apple a day, but works better. So I had the taste, that close up.
Oh, I love that.
And so some other thing you want to consider with sensory language, there's a concept called psychological distance. So what that means is how far away is the need or the service from you, both spatially and temporally. So let's say, okay, I need to refi my house next year, right? Or I'm an agency. Okay, you know what? In 5 years, I need to do this project because this is falling apart. It's far away. Well, people tend to think about things that are far away in more abstract terms. And so what happens with that is if you use sensory language or images that correspond to the distance, they tend to respond better to those. And it's more persuasive. So for example, if something's far away, what I would do is, okay, it's far away. I would use images that are far away. Or if you have this is the coolest thing I saw. There's a researcher, I forgot his name, but they used the level of the horizon. So if the horizon was lower, so it looked like it was farther away, that worked best for services or products that were far away in time or space. So you had to drive really far to get it, or they didn't need it yet, but in the future. And also sensory language, like senses that are far away, sight, sound tend to be farther away from you. So what that did is if you use that type of language for things that are off in the future, it's more persuasive. If it's something like close up, like, oh, they need it right now. Images that appear closer. So even the horizon line, it's higher, so it looks like it's closer, is more persuasive. The type of sensory language you use, taste, touch, is more persuasive for things that are closer. And it gets really interesting because if it's something that is tangible, researchers have found that like a tangible product. So you're doing an RFP for an actual like piece of equipment or whatever, something tangible, text actually is more persuasive. However, if it's something that is a little more abstract, like a service or design or something out in the future, pictures work better. So based on, just some of those basic understandings, knowing, okay, when to use more text, when to use more pictures, because there are times when, hey, heavy text is actually desirable. It's not often.
No, don't say that.
Yeah, I know. But here's the caveat. It's not very often. If it's a service, no, I would do more photos. But there are some times, but understanding when and why is key. Some of that understanding, and so you can start basically tailoring your response to some things that you've read. And these aren't things that are, oh, someone had this idea. It's like, no, it's been researched, it's peer reviewed, there it is. And so I can't guarantee it'll work in every situation, but generally, hey, this is research, it looks like it's going to work. And just understanding those little things. Yeah. And there are a lot of books out there that can kind of go through those different theories.
And there's some that, we've talked about some simple things that people can do. So this doesn't need to get super complex. It just needs to be thinking about some of these words and thinking about your visuals differently. We're going to take a quick break for a quick commercial. We're going to be right back and we're going to talk to Sean. We're going to talk about some future trends. We're going to have him give us like one key tip of something that you can implement immediately. So stay tuned. We will be right back.
Is your content library a whole lot of blah? Is it non-existent or outdated? Do you find yourself constantly reinventing the wheel? Our industry expert writers dial into your precise value proposition and differentiators to create a well-stocked arsenal of winning content. Learn more at the RFPSuccessCompany.com.
All right, everybody, welcome back from the break. Again, we're here with Sean Stewart talking all about the psychology of consumer behavior and how we can apply this to proposals. And there's been so much gold in this so far. I loved the conversation. I'm going to take us back a little ways here, the conversation about the call out boxes, because one of my biggest pet peeves is call out boxes, because people will be like, oh, just like you said, Sean, like people will say, we need to break up the text here. Let's put a call out box. And they'll pull something out like, we were founded in 1937 and blah, blah, blah. Or we have 17 medical professionals that yada, yada, yada. None of that is important in a call out box, right? And everything that you're saying here and some of the key words and some of like that building competence and building trust and getting that warmth in, those are the kinds of things that need to be showcased in those call out boxes or any visuals for that matter. So I love, love, love hearing that. So one of the things that we are always preaching to our clients is that the sale begins long before the RFP is released, right? If you're just going to bid on an RFP that comes across your plate, it's cold, you don't know them, you have a really low chance of winning. How can we apply this kind of philosophy to the conversations during relationship building, even before that RFP comes out?
Yeah. So one thing about that, and I was talking to someone recently, and, everyone says, okay, you have to talk to them before the RFP's out. And I always wonder, so why? And I think the assumption is, oh, so you know their needs and you can understand them. And I think that's it. But I also think that the fact that getting to know the client, I don't think is necessarily a means to an end, but it's actually the ends in itself. I think the fact that you go out there and talk to them, I think primes the client to think of you as the solution to their issue. So they associate you with the successful outcome. And
hopefully,
hopefully, unless you really blow it in the interviews and talking to them. But I think that, because this is a huge risk. I mean, these people's careers can be on the line, the project manager, that hire you. And so I think that getting to know them helps build that trust. And I think that fact in and of itself, I think is one of the key things, if not more so than understanding the needs. Because
Well, and also, wouldn't you say that, as you were talking about, building competence, building warmth, as you get to know the client and you get to know who's going to be the buyer and or the evaluators, wouldn't that also help in knowing more about how you need to be building competence and warmth in that
yes,
proposal?
yes, that too. Yeah, and there's one way to do that. There's something called means end theory. Once I describe this, I think everyone that writes RFPs be like, "Oh, I know that." It's kind of like what we always do. You sit down and you say, "Okay, what are our win themes?" And that's, I think, a little cliche and a little overused, but there's great. It's a good exercise. Like, okay, so what do they need? Okay, what is the attribute of our service or product that meets that need? How does it benefit them? How do we prove it? So means end theory is kind of like that, but it's a lot deeper. They use what's called the laddering interview. So how it works is you ask, like, so for example, on, let's say it's a IT provider, and you're doing a proposal for an IT provider, and you're trying to like do the pre-work before the RP is out. It's okay. So when you selected a consultant, why'd you select this consultant versus another one? Oh, well, they were more responsive. Okay. Oh, that's great. Why is being more responsive so important to you? What does that do for you? What does it mean if they're not responsive? And then they may something like, oh, well, then that way we have less downtime. Okay, great. When we have an issue. So why is getting back on track after an issue and less downtime so important? Then you go to the next thing and you drive it in all the way, and you get to the point to where it's like, it's almost where you get to the value, the underlying value. And so it could be something like, when they say, oh, well, it saves us money. We don't lose money. Okay, so why is not losing money so important? So, oh, because we need to be responsible. So why is being responsible? And you just keep going, going, going. And then you
Yeah.
find out that, hey, there's a sense of pride underneath all that of getting your system and keeping it up and running. So it's kind of like what we already do, but a little deeper. And with the lettering interviews, which you can do, and this is normally done with consumer goods and with hundreds, thousands of people, but you can still do it over several conversations as part of your regular pre-sale or business development activities with all the stakeholders. And what you can do is you break it out into, okay, so what is the attribute of the product? Okay, so what is the functional consequence? What is the tangible benefit? But also you look at what is the psychosocial benefit, because the tangible benefit will usually lead to the psychosocial. Basically, psychosocial benefits, I feel good, I feel responsible, like I'm protecting the company. And then once you understand why that's important, then you get to the value. And what people do is you actually list them all out, and you can start seeing interconnections between them. And what that will do is give you the win theme, but also give you language that will resonate with all the decision makers or most of the decision makers. So that, it's a standard practice in consumer psychology, but I think there's ways that you can modify it to use in proposals and what we do.
Yeah, I think so too. I think that's beautiful. And it is interesting because people will say to me too, like, why does it matter that we've built a relationship? They're going to ask us the questions they're going to ask. And it's like, yeah, but you can't answer them appropriately and really hit on kind of what their hot buttons are and
Mhm.
what they really care about. And a lot of times they don't even know. And that kind of questioning that you just talked about helps uncover things that they didn't necessarily even
Mhm.
realize.
Yeah.
So I think that that's a really great method for doing that. I'm going to switch gears a bit here. I want to ask you about the future. Like, what future trends do you see as having an impact in how we respond to RFPs, short term or long term? And, maybe has the pandemic changed anything? Tell us a little bit about what you see for the
Yeah.
future.
Short-term directions, and I think the pandemic is actually speeding this up, is we're seeing more and more digital submissions.
Oh, thank God. I know. I'm so
Yes, I
happy
know.
about
Yeah, 8 copies plus a CD-ROM with the, yeah, it's like, guys, really? Just ask for the digital. Oh, and my favorite, I had a client once ask for 8 copies, a CD-ROM, and an unbound copy so they can make copies themselves. I'm like, really, guys? Yeah. But
And by the
but
way,
digital,
it's due in 2 weeks, right?
yeah. But the digital, and the cool thing about the digital submission, it gives you a more opportunity, more flexibility to do other things. You can
Right.
create an interactive PDF.
Yes.
With I think the next steps will be with our digital submissions is make it more interactive.
Love that.
So for example, one thing that a long time, this was actually on a hardbound print proposal years ago. It was for a park. It was a skate park. And what I wanted to do, I found a printer that, the tabs would
Yep.
actually, you can actually die cut so they can pop out things and put it together to make like a little skate ramp, a little finger skateboard. I thought, you know
That's
what,
adorable.
you could actually play with the proposal. You interact with it, or do something where you have like a magnetic, they actually had like magnetic like covers, and you had a die cut pop out, and you can actually rearrange the layout of your park or whatever it was. I thought that'd be so awesome, but it was way
That's so
expensive.
fun. And, because these things are boring as heck for the poor
Exactly.
evaluators, right? Like they're usually so
Yeah.
boring. How fun would that be?
Yeah. But the cost and versus how much we get from the project was just, it didn't work out. But it's a cool idea. And so, but now with digital, you can do that. You can have an exhibit, you have an image on the PDF. Hey, here's our potential layout. By the way, click and drag and you can move stuff around if you want to
That's
change it.
cool.
And the cool thing about that leads back to some of the visual cues and especially the haptic cues, like the handling, because what they found is in a store, once you touch an object, you're more likely to buy it. And the cool thing is, if you touch a screen, like a touch screen, it kind of has the
Yeah.
same effect. So if you're playing
Interesting.
with it, it can increase purchasing intention. Like, hey, I like this. You interact with it. You like it more. It's more stimulating. You're probably
Yep.
a little bit more likely to select them, especially if you're neck and neck. So I think that's one of the things that's short term. Another thing will be, things are going to be more data driven, really quantifying things. You can't do everything, but there are some things that you can do. I mean, we already have metrics of, okay, win, loss, how often we get interviewed, shortlisted, things like that. But, it goes beyond that, so one thing that I've done is, we have the dreaded go, no go form or interview that people may or may not listen, or they try to talk themselves out of a no go. Um, so what I did, and it's like, well, it's arbitrary. It's like, how do I know? And so this actually corresponds to anything. So for 2 years, I kept our go, no go forms, every single one, put it on a spreadsheet, coded 1 for loss, 2 for win, and then ran a correlation. You can do it in Excel. Correlation on the whole thing, and it was a really bad correlation. It was like 0.5 or something. I'm like, yeah, no. But then when I went back and looked at the individual questions, ran a correlation on individual questions, I only kept the ones that had like a 0.7 or above. And it's funny because some had like a 0.2 correlation, some had a negative correlation. So I'm like, okay, that's really bad. I took those out and then reran it. I have up here the correlation coefficient like 0.8. So I'm like, that's pretty good. And
Right.
so I did that. And then I also looked at the individual scores and said, okay, so we had, based on these questions, we have a range from 0 to 30 points. And so I looked every single one. Okay, what was the score? And how often did we win when we got this score or above? And what I found was that once we scored 20, we won 80% or above. And the cool thing was there's a big drop between 20 and 19. It went from like 80% to like 60%. I was like, oh, hey, cool. So 20% is our cutoff. And I could go back and say, guys, when we score this or above, this is what we get. And the one thing I do too is I make sure more than one person is filling out the form. So everyone has to agree on the form. Or if one person's really pushing and I feel skewing the data, I have everyone do it separately and then average them out. That way it kind of gets rid of that. But you can do that. And then you can even take it a step further with some basic knowledge of statistics. You can do it in Excel, but it's a pain. But, I did a linear regression on the go, no go form, which is like a correlation on steroids. Basically, what it told me is you look at the variance in a win and loss, and it told me how much each question contributed to that variance. And what I did is took the highest number. So I'm like, okay, so 30% of whether or not we win or lose comes down to, did our project manager meet their project manager before the RFP? 25%
Wow.
or something was, or 20% after that was like, did we talk to them 6 months ahead of time? So half of the variance, whether or not we won or lost, was those two questions. So it's like, hey guys, focus on these two areas. So it helps you narrow down where you can have the biggest impact. So I think that's the short term.
One of the things that does also is that, for proposal teams that are constantly trying to have a seat at the table, that are feeling like they're kind of like the ugly stepchildren, this gives you a voice in that, and you're adding huge value back to the organization to say, look, when we say yes and we put these 2 points aside and say, oh, well, we scored low on these 2 things, but we really want to bid, rah, rah, let's go. And then we continue to find out that those are the clinchers. That's huge data that can be shared and value added up to leadership, in my opinion, because it's a lot of money to bid on something that you lose.
Yeah, and it helps you, and based on that, we were able to, I think, cut the number of RFPs in half, but we won more money. We won more and we got more, so it's like, there's things that you can do to really focus your efforts. I think long term, some people still are not too sure about this, but I think neuromarketing. I got introduced to this because one of my thesis advisors, that's what he does. Basically, it looks at the biological functions involved in purchasing decisions. So what happens in your brain chemistry, brain activity, when you're making a purchasing decision? There's a company called Immersion Neuroscience. That's my thesis advisor, Dr. Barraza, a company he helped found. What they do is they put people, they'll take like a music video or a movie trailer, and they'll put on like a Google Glass and an Apple Watch or something, or like a Fitbit. And what they'll do is they'll track their eye movements, they'll track their pupil dilation, they'll track their pulse, galvanic skin response, and everything else. And based on that, they can figure out if that music video or that movie, or at least trailer, will be a hit, or people will like it, based on your biological responses to things. And it's really interesting because there are some things that you can do still. One thing is understanding the role of oxytocin, the neurotransmitter, because that's involved in trust. That's involved in liking and empathy. And so, it's not like you're going to like lace your proposal with like oxytocin so they get a whiff of it or something. There have been companies that made oxytocin cologne, which I think is a horrible idea because the salesperson will actually smell it too. So it's going to throw them off as well. And it's kind of unethical. But, there are ways, like, for example, storytelling can actually increase levels of oxytocin. So when you ever hear people say, hey, if you have a project experience or project case study, make it a story. That's why it's effective. Because if you make the client or your proposal read like a story, like your approach, like they're the hero in the story, or just anything, make it a story. Make the hero, make the challenge that they do. That tends to build a little bit of empathy for the subject in that story. So, you have a project description. Hey, the client you're talking about, they're the hero. The person reading it will have empathy. That increases oxytocin. Oxytocin has a role in trust. So if you write it well, and again, it's not going to be like, oh, it's like a story, they're tired every time. No, it's a little bit of a nudge, and so these are all things that add up, and understanding how that works and understanding how different things influence your decision, like, again, the oxytocin, you have an interview.
It is really fascinating.
Yeah.
Wouldn't it be fun to, line up the evaluators on a particular proposal and have them have Google glasses on and get their brain reaction to the different proposals
and eye movement, where are they looking? And that's another thing too, because people, based on eye movement studies, people tend to read in the Z pattern or look at a page in the Z pattern. So that's how you want to line up your information. But also little things like you're going to your short list, you're going to interview, bring chocolate. Chocolate increases when you eat chocolate, it increases oxytocin levels. So there's like little things like that, it's like, okay, yeah, here, but also providing a gift increases trust as well. So there's a lot of different things that you can do. But yeah, I think neuromarketing, it's still fairly new, but I think that's going to be the next 10, 15 years from now, we're going to be start talking about that.
That would be fascinating to see how that plays. Well, Sean, this has been a really fun, fascinating conversation. I know I keep using the word fascinating, but it's different, I think, for a lot of us to be thinking this way. And I think you've given us some really great tips. So if people want to get in touch with you, how can they best do that?
Yeah, just search me out on LinkedIn. And I think if you can spread that out. And then my email, always happy to talk to anyone.
Perfect. Well, we will have your LinkedIn and your email in the show notes, along with a couple of things that you referenced. We'll have some links to those as well. So thank you so much for being on the show, Sean. It has been a pleasure to have you here.
Thanks. Been fun.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, everybody. So thank you for being here and listening to the show. If you haven't already done so, we always appreciate your 5-star ratings if you're enjoying this podcast. So wherever you're listening, give us your nice ratings. We love that. We love that. So on behalf of my wonderful guest and myself, I want to thank you all for listening to the RFP Success Show.
This has been another episode of the RFP Success Show with Lisa Rehurek, 8-time author, speaker, and CEO of the RFP Success Company. Thank you for joining us. If you have feedback on today's episode, email us at podcast@rfpsuccess.com. No matter your business size, industry, if you have an in-house RFP team, or need outside support, the RFP Success Company helps increase RFP win ratios by 10, 20, and even 50%. Learn more at the rfpsuccesscompany.com.